Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure on behalf of the College of Humanities and Social Science to introduce Professor Dorrian, the new incumbent of the Forbes Chair of Architecture. My name is John Lowry. I'm the Dean of Undergraduate Studies in the College of Humanities and Social Science. But in another role I occupy, I am a member of the Sala, of the same school as Mark, and it gives me even greater pleasure to introduce Mark as a friend and colleague of many years standing. Mark Dorrian was appointed to the Forbes Chair in 2013, but his involvement with the school in its various guises goes back a long way. Mark is a Part 1 and 2 graduate of the ECA Heriot Watt version of this school, and after graduation in the late 1980s, he then moved on to the Architectural Association in London and to the Istituto Universitario di Architettura di Venezia for his PhD. His early academic career was somewhat less exotic and saw him working as an academic galley slave in Dundee, Edinburgh and Falmouth for a period all at the same time, before he settled on the old architecture school at the University of Edinburgh in 1997. After 13 years in which his teaching and research made a major contribution to the renaissance of that school, and his towering presence as a dominating centre-half was in no small measure responsible for the success of the staff football team at that time, crushing the students on every occasion we played them. Mark retired from football and left Edinburgh as a reader in 2010 to take up the post of Professor of Architectural Research at Newcastle University, where he was responsible for the creation of new research-led postgraduate programmes in architecture and related disciplines. After 3 hugely successful years in Newcastle, success that was marked each year by the award of the university's Professorial Award for Outstanding Contribution, Mark returned to Edinburgh to take up the Forbes Chair, a chair that we had left vacant for about 2 decades prior to his appointment. As Forbes Professor, we have in Mark Dorrian an academic leader whose contribution is important not only to the professional architecture programme in Sala, but across Sala as a whole and indeed across ECA. His work, his scholarship, has always been marked by a cross-disciplinary approach, especially in the areas of theory, design and visual culture. And he's ideally placed to contribute to an emerging and distinctive ECA research culture, a culture appropriate to the unique blend of disciplines and approaches found in the college. Mark is an internationally recognised academic, active across the fields of architectural teaching, research and practice. He currently holds visiting professorships at the Architect School in Aarhus in Denmark and at Tianjin University in China. He was formerly visiting professor at Michigan and visiting scholar at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. He's occupied important roles in all aspects of scholarly discourse in universities across the world. His work has been marked by a deep commitment to cross-disciplinary study. This is reflected in the enormous breadth of his outputs, which range from his abiding interest in concepts of the grotesque, the conceptualization and representation of the city, and the culture of landscape in its broadest sense. His work spans topics in architecture and urbanism, art history and theory, and media studies, and has appeared in major publications such as Cabinet, Cora, Cultural Politics, the Journal of Architecture, the Journal of Narrative Theory, Log, Parallax, Radical Philosophy, and Word and Image. He's been responsible for notable and much acclaimed books, often and typically in fruitful collaboration with others, such as with Julian Rose, Deterritorializations, Revisioning Landscapes and Politics back in 2003, and with Frédéric Poussin, Seeing from Above, the Aerial View in Visual Culture in 2012. A collection of his essays from the past 12 years is imminent. The book is called Writing on the Image, Architecture, the City, and the Politics of Representation, and that has already received ringing endorsements from eminent and respected peers. From Ian Bohl at UC Berkeley, I quote, "With the eye of an architect, the pen of a poet, and the toolkit of a skilled critical urbanist, Dorrian brilliantly ranges over the terrain of a fully historified modernity and its representations, from Enlightenment Edinburgh eastwards and westwards to the Googleplex and beyond, out there on the high frontier of the spectacle." And Catherine Ingraham, the Professor of Architectural History and Theory at the Pratt Institute in New York, this book of essays, written by one of our best contemporary critics, has a deeply persuasive and pleasurable splendour. The subtle weave and informed precision of its writing and thinking binds us to its subject matter, the unruliness of things, and the dilemmas of representation. Mark is currently working on the political history of air conditioning, which I'm looking forward to, and in a pamphlet on robotic weapons, Welcome to the Dronosphere, for the Retort Collective. A key aspect of Mark's research is the laboratory of his architectural practice. In 1997, together with his colleague Adrian Hawker, he founded the design research atelier Metis. Since then, Mark and Adrian have produced a sequence of installations, architectural and urban proposals that have been published and exhibited internationally at venues such as the Venice Architecture Biennale. Their influential and widely circulated first book, Urban Cartographies, appeared in 2002, and in 2006 they were competitively selected by a jury led by the eminent French architect Claude Parent as one of the top 25 emergent practices in Europe. Metis is now sufficiently recognized and has built up such a track record over the years that we now have an amazing retrospective exhibition of those 18 years of practice, experimentation, and research. Exhibited first at Aarhus, the exhibition On the Surface can be viewed after this lecture in the sculpture court downstairs, although it also repays observation from above, appropriately enough given Mark's interest in the aerial view, and you may do that with a glass of wine at the reception to be held immediately after the lecture and on the sculpture court balcony. I can tell you now that we will have some time for questions at the end, so we'll have a roving mic at the end. But now we'll turn to the lecture. Professor Mark Dorrian, what's interesting on the ascendency of an evaluative term?
Thank you, John. Thanks. I can only go downhill from here after that. Thank you. It's a very kind introduction, and I'm grateful to everyone who's here for coming tonight. I'm especially grateful to people who have travelled quite a distance. It's very much, very much appreciated. So I wanted to use this, the opportunity of this lecture to, I think, really focus specifically on questions related to design teaching rather than, say, history and theory subjects. And the topic that I wanted to speak about is, it's something in a way that's been on my mind for a while, and this lecture really has given me an opportunity to sort of think about it in a little more detail. So our conversations with students when we teach architectural design, and this is true whether they take place in tutorials and reviews of work, etc., have become saturated with the word interesting. Now it has, I would guess, more than any other, become the key term that we use to respond to and to evaluate design work. Indeed, sometimes it can seem that it's the only thing we have to say, in some ways maybe the only thing that's left for us to say. As an evaluative category, it has an uncanny ability to absorb and supersede other terms. And its seeming indeterminacy allows it to encompass a broad range of possible meanings, which in turn make a lot hinge on the way that the word is enacted. So there's a big difference between saying, interesting, and that's interesting. And of course, this ubiquity and malleability spreads beyond architectural design discourses. So one colleague from another subject area in ECA has told me that his tutor had 3 ways of responding to work. If he didn't like it, he called it interesting. If he thought it was good, he called it very interesting. And if it was even better, he said, really very interesting. So once I noticed this, my friend says, he was lost to me as a teacher. So something I think to be symptomatic of the situation is the difficulty that we find doing without the term. And I know because there have been times when I've tried. But interestingly, nothing else seems to do quite the same job, as effectively or in the same way. Yet even as we're so clearly invested in and heavily committed to it, we seem to harbour anxieties, concerns about some hollowness or emptiness in this judgment that seems in so many ways a way of avoiding making a judgment, a way of saying something that in fact says nothing. Now, certainly I found that it has been enough to say to colleagues that I'm thinking about this, that I'm doing some work on it, for them to voluntarily and without compulsion I add, try to give up its use, as if it was a kind of collectively shared dirty secret, something that we really always knew was wrong in some way, but have indulged until it's pointed out. But we're not alone. Although I'm concerned directly here with architectural design teaching and the way we talk about design work, what is very striking is the extent to which the term is everywhere. As Sian and Guy, whose wonderful book Our Aesthetic Categories I'll be referring to throughout this talk tonight, notes, interesting is an evaluation that continues to circulate promiscuously, if often in a telling way surreptitiously, in virtually all contemporary writing on cultural artifacts. One of the main things we want scholarship to do is to make its objects of study interesting, to make them more vivid for us. If we are writing a statement of support for a research student, perhaps the strongest thing we can say is that she has an ability to formulate and pursue interesting research questions. And we're pleased when people say things to us like, "Your work is always so interesting." In contexts like these, good seems too inert, and brilliant too polished or thin or brittle. But with interesting, well, then there's something to talk about, and that's a point to which we'll shortly return. When the renowned modernist master Mies van der Rohe pronounced, "I'd rather be good than interesting," the phrasing implied that for Mies, it was possible to be one or the other, but probably not both at the same time. To be good presumably meant to produce works of universally recognizable and enduring value, as opposed to ones that were mere curiosities, distractions that might detain us for a while, but were soon to be passed over for something else. However, the timelessness of this aphorism was itself destined to run into trouble. And so, in the mid-1990s, in a discussion of what he called the heteroarchitecture of Los Angeles architects, Frank Gehry, Morphosis, Eric Orne-Moss, etc., we find Charles Jenks suggesting that the inversion of the Miesian proposition, "I'd rather be interesting than good," was almost the dictum of the LA School of Architects, with its love of the botched but fascinating joint. Here Jenks ironically played interesting LA heteroarchitecture, which he saw as reflecting the multicultural dynamism of the city, off against the boring, waspish uptightness of the monotonous Miesian downtown. As he put it, Mies for the classes and heteroarchitecture for the masses. It was notable in Jenks's argument that while the terms had been switched around, thus reversing their priority, the opposition very much remained intact, with the very Miesian locus of the detail being the point of discrimination, in this case the botched but fascinating joint. Now, against this background, what I find to be very striking today, certainly in the kind of teaching studio environments with which I'm familiar, is the way in which the opposition itself seems to have been dissolved, and we have arrived at a situation in which one of the terms has been completely absorbed by the other. Now, it's good to be interesting, indeed better than to be only good, which is no longer what it used to be. This has been accompanied at the same time by a kind of rhetorical ratcheting up of the term and a new intensity of relation with it. Theorizations of interesting as an evaluative category tend to stress minima, coolness, low levels of affect, the minimal condition of approval. But today what's been described as the merely interesting, that's the silent merely that so often seem to prefix the word, seems to be frequently enthusiastically transformed into a not so silent, really interesting. In accord with this, the most disappointing experience a student can have in presenting their design work is not to raise the interest of the critics. In a real way, and I think in a significant way, this seems worse than being told that one's project is bad. Because if it's bad, it's touched on something of significance, produced a degree of effect, and perhaps even issued some kind of challenge to prevailing norms. And I think this holds a clue for us in thinking about what we mean when we describe design work as interesting. Certainly there's a notable tradition of celebrated architects recounting how they were misjudged by their teachers, and at least retrospectively taking as an affirmation the terms of that critique. To provoke a strong response is something, potentially something important, but to provoke lack of interest, well, that isn't even a provocation. So what I want to do then in this talk is to reflect a little on the rise of the interesting as an evaluative term in contemporary studio pedagogy, for I think it testifies to important recent shifts in architectural education, what we think it should be, and what we feel are its roles and responsibilities. At the same time, I think it relates to a reconfiguration of our sense of what it is to teach architectural design, and even a latent worry about the degree to which that term, teaching, is even tenable, given its teleological and instrumentally didactic overtones. One thing that we might argue here, for example, is that we start to specifically value projects as interesting whenever our normative understanding of what teaching is begins to become unstable. Certainly from one point of view, interesting might be dismissed as a kind of diplomatic euphemism, a sort of woolly way of talking around the issues. And no doubt this is a danger, but surely we can find more productive ways of thinking about it than that. In this spirit, the questions then I want to ask concern what sort of thing we are doing or might be doing when we use the term. What does it reflect and what are its consequences? And why today might we have a new degree of attachment to it? And all this adds up to what I've come to think of as the April Fool's Day talk question, namely, what's interesting about interesting? Now, in a moment, I'll frame some arguments on this, but first we need to channel the discussion through the very particular history of the term as an aesthetic category, and here I'll be drawing heavily on the work of Xian Guy. So in her account, she traces the emergence of interesting as both a judgment and style, as she puts it, to German Romantic literary criticism of the late 18th century, and in particular to Friedrich Schlegel's reflections on modern literary form, which he specifically defined as interesting as distinct from the beautiful art of ancient Greece. While the art of the ancients was characterized by universality, necessity, and finality, that of the moderns, who are epochally closed off from their predecessors, inevitably takes the form, according to Schlegel, of an endless striving, a serial process of particularization that can never be concluded. As it is cut off from any final, satisfying determination, Schlegel comes to describe the interesting in terms of quantitative intensities. After the possibility of the absolute, there can only be a process of intensification, each stage of which, because non-absolute, is logically capable of being surpassed. Every original individual, Schlegel writes, that contains a particular quantity of intellectual content or aesthetic energy is interesting. There can be no endpoint. Even that which is most interesting could be more interesting. Now, we clearly have a view here of the kind of conceptual framework that underlies the Miesian opposition between the good and the interesting. But at the same time, we see the beginnings of an articulation of what we might call a post-theological aesthetic, that is, a non-beautiful aesthetic that arises after the possibility of transcendence or after it is renounced. Now, importantly, as Schlegel's theory of romantic literature developed and became focused on the form of the novel, his thinking on the interesting became linked to a movement whereby the conceptual reflection on the work of art becomes absorbed into it. And Guy puts it this way: for Schlegel, interesting also seems to mark a convergence of art with conceptual discourse about art, or an internalization by art, which conceptually becomes philosophical or reflective of the relation between theory and praxis. This tendency is exemplified in Schlegel's call for a theory of the novel that would itself take the form of a novel, a condition that he recognized in Goethe's Wilhelm Meister. If beauty is bound by external rules, then in the modern era of the interesting, the rules themselves emerge as a problem that has to be internalized within the artwork. Now, all this may seem rather distinct from the day-to-day manner in which we talk about design with architecture students. But I think it casts light on the way that we use certain evaluative terms and even the kinds of feeling that we have and that we share when we do. It also shows the way in which our predilection for interesting shades from style of criticism into something that looks like an ethics of criticism. Let's return to the Misesian opposition between good and interesting. When I use the term good, I feel I am making a conclusive judgment, one that implies closure, completion, and finality. I express my admiration and position myself as external to the work. Good is in a certain way always a last word, and that's its point. On the other hand, to call work interesting is immediately to understand it as something permeable. Interesting is inevitably in the position of a first word. It is future-orientated and leading, and more than that, tends to the participatory and the mutual. When we say work is interesting, with all the burden of subsequent articulation that entails, we're less critics standing outside the work than co-producers of it. In a significant way, interesting therefore locates us alongside the student and involved in a complex process of socialization in which the emergent work itself is part. Here the work is interesting in its full etymological sense, inter-esse, that is, being between, or in the midst of, or in the interval. Now we're close here to the distinction Bruno Latour has made between what he calls matters of fact and matters of concern. If the term interesting marks a matter of concern, something around which attachments and discourse develop, the decidedness and terminal judgment of the good tends to locate it rather as a matter of fact. Now, all this is to say that when we describe a work as interesting, we produce a kind of rerouting of critical authority. We seem to make a knowledge-based claim while simultaneously placing it in abeyance. This condition of present inarticulacy, accompanied as it is by the sense that there is much to say, that there will be much to say, displaces the critic's dominance over the work, and may even register a kind of epistemological and pedagogical modesty, a doubt about the very possibility of final words, and a recognition of the limits and partial nature of any claims that we might make. Now, it seems to me that one of the key pieces of architectural criticism that evidently works in this mode is Robin Evans' celebrated review of Daniel Libeskind's chamberworks drawings, which were exhibited at the Architectural Association in London in October 1983. Titled In Front of Lines That Leave Nothing Behind, Evans' text deftly navigates the sorts of questions posed by Libeskind's drawings, questions about in what way we should see them, about assumptions of frontality, the hermeneutics of depth, etc. Now, in one way, Evans turns out to have rather a lot to say about the drawings. He describes them closely, recognizes that they emanate from architectural technique, that they're made of specific drawing instruments, and so on. But at the same time, he holds open the question of what these things actually are, these drawings that occupy a kind of enigmatic zone by offering a particular disciplinary or cognitive or institutional challenge. That is, by being of architecture, but not being architecture, at least in any straightforward way. This, it seems to me, is a virtually emblematic example of architectural criticism in its really interesting mode. Evidencing strong affect and attachment, Evan leaves us in no doubt that he is compelled, he's gripped by what he sees, an implicit challenge to the normative conventions that undergird a practice, and more on this soon, and a resultant interpretative hesitancy, a sense of something unsayable, or at least not yet able to be said. As Nga at one point comments, interest begins as a feeling of not knowing exactly what we are feeling, and as Evans' review finishes, marvellous, more to be said, not now. In his article, Evans insists on the opacity of the chamberworks drawings, which he describes as another kind of opacity, no one to talk about, no transactions to record, no past to reconstruct. This opacity is referred to in opposition to what he calls frontal interpretation, by which he means an approach to the work that tries to read it in terms of depth conditions. And this in turn leads him to imagine a form of criticism as interpretation that displays, as he puts it, an entirely different orientation, reading potency, not latency. It would become as uncertain an enterprise as any kind of search not assured of at least the possibility of verification. End of quote. If the judgment of the good implies and requires a condition of transparency, the interesting, which inevitably is tied to deferral and not yet, or Evans not now, seems to turn in some sort of condition of opacity. In this sense, to call something interesting is always a way of saying that there's more to be said, a way of maintaining discourse and keeping it circulating in relation to its objects. The terms of Evans' discussion are remarkably close to the idea of the enigma as formulated by the philosopher Mario Pagnola, who writes that enigma draws strength from the questioning tension that it arouses. Unlike the secret, which is dissolved in the process of being communicated, enigma is capable of simultaneous explanation on many different registers of meaning, all of which are equally valid, and it is thus able to open up an intermediate space that is not necessarily bound to be filled. He consequently characterizes the nature of enigma as transit, an imperceptible inching toward something that is different. And here we seem brought again close to Schlegel, for whom Jan Mieszkowski writes, "The interesting is an experience with the possibility of difference, with what is different, with what makes a difference, and with what could make oneself or a given state of affairs different." Related to the enigma, the interesting seems often connected to situations in which there's some kind of flaw or problem, some condition in which the picture does not appear to fit properly together. Again, it differentiates itself from the good or beautiful, which are constituted by the absence of any such flaw. Here the problem itself becomes the point of attachment onto which interest fastens, an attachment that can have a powerful libidinal investment. Now, the classic example of this, I suppose, is Alfred Hitchcock's film Vertigo, in which James Stewart's retired detective is hired by an old friend to track his wife, the enigmatic Madeline, who is apparently possessed by the spirit of her great-grandmother, Carlotta Valdez. Here, this compellingly interesting woman is figured as a problem, a mystery whose play of identities seems to vertiginously dissolve the existential ground of the life-death binary itself, which is symbolized in the famous dream sequence in which the James Stewart character falls into the abyss of Carlotta's opened grave. The larger point here is that things that don't fit, flaws, dissonances, anamorphoses, gaps of one kind or another, are interesting because they make visible and hence problematize the commitments that underlie normative constructions, conventional practices, and realities to which we are habituated. All commitments that the good tends to hide by silently affirming and conforming to them. This is why what is judged to be bad work can still be interesting, and why indeed there's a long tradition of talking about such work in this way. Guy notes that in Schlegel's 1800 manifesto, Dialogue and Poetry, and other writings published in the Athenaeum, interesting also seems to refer to how work can still be somewhat good, even when it's largely bad. Work might be poorly constructed, ill-judged, clumsily executed, but it can do all this in an interesting way, by posing questions back to the limitations of the criteria that it has failed to satisfy. I think this is why, in architectural design teaching studios, the kind of work we affirm as really interesting often seems to involve some kind of swerve or parallax condition, for these give rise to this metacritical effect. Such projects seem to aim at a slightly different place than the brief itself does, the brief being the document that describes the task. But because of the significance of the questions they raise about the assumptions or limitations inherent in the way the teaching project is framed, etc., they have the effect of making us wonder whether this was really, after all, the place at which the brief we wrote was aiming. If, as I suggested earlier, the discourse of the interesting positions the tutor as a co-producer of the work, we see here from the other side how interesting projects position the student as a co-producer of the brief. Now, famously, the writer Henry James identified the interesting as the criterion of value for the novel, and this has been interpreted in relation to the way it dramatizes the tension between the particular and the general. That is, individual character as conveyed through first-person narrative in relation to the overarching structures of bourgeois convention, etc., in which the life stories of the protagonists are entangled. Here, interest is understood to arise out of the friction between the two, and it's not hard to see a relation with architectural design here. For it seems to me, at least, we are constantly encouraging our students to strive for something like this, and rewarding as the best work projects that do. In short, we seek projects that dramatize this relation between the particular and the general, where by dramatize I mean make legible or visible. This is to say, we want students to develop and critically position the particularity of their individual project in relation to the broader generalities within which they, as producers, are situated. So generalities such as professional discourses, technical modalities, the institutional context of the academy, the political relations that structure production, etc. Now, by critically position here, I mean knowingly position in such a way that their work productively grates against these broader conditions, making them newly palpable, but also putting a kind of pressure upon them. In which case, recalling Mario Pagnola on the Enigma, the projects could be characterized as transitive and inching towards something that is different. Such projects that reflect upon their own conditions of possibility, that are critically self-aware, and that fold that critical historical self-awareness into themselves look rather similar to Schlegel's notion, which you'll recall was strongly identified with the interesting, of a theory of the novel that itself would take the form of a novel. One of the main reasons that we use interesting, one of the main reasons that we use interesting all the time is that really interesting projects, in this precise sense, are in the end what we ask for in the briefs we write, and what we have come to see as the most sophisticated, that is reflexive, self-aware, fully achieved work. And perhaps that is also the reason why our evaluations, like my colleague's tutor, whom I mentioned at the start, so often seem to take place on a scale of degrees of intensity of interest. Interesting, very interesting, really very interesting. So it seems to me that this also throws light on the great emphasis on process in contemporary architectural studio pedagogies. In her discussion of the interesting in modern art, Guy focuses on conceptual art, and particularly on the serial artwork as an aesthetic of minor differentiation that takes place within a larger horizon of technological standardization. Now, the architectural design process is inevitably serial. Students work through chains of representations structured through relations of difference that we tend to describe, or hope to be, design development. But at the same time, we are aware that this is not a straightforward case of accumulation. It's not that there's sort of a constant building up within the moment of the project. Instead, we realize that things are set aside or are not taken up or go unrecognized in the process, which is to say that at each stage in the design process, in each representation made, there exist complex potentialities that point in different directions and suggest alternative futures for the project than the one that will eventually be arrived at. Thus, when we exhort students to curate and display their design process, as we now almost always do, we relativize the final submission submission or state of the project by placing it within a series of potential other projects to which it at the same time belongs. We register the finality of the endpoint as provisional, marking it as just one position within a series that could extend or even be differently configured. It's not uncommon, for instance, for reviewers to prefer an earlier iteration of the work. Moreover, we expect the display of process to be the vehicle through which the internalization of critical reflection within the work itself is displayed and made intelligible. Both of these, the loss of finality and the self-reflection of the work within itself, return us directly to the aesthetics of the interesting as it was theorized by Schlegel. If really interesting work is, as I've suggested, work that addresses from the inside, as it were, the meta-conditions within which architecture is pursued. Now, it seems likely that there's a relation between the rise of the term in pedagogic discourse and architecture's contemporary disciplinary anxieties. Anxieties to do with loss of agency, cultural displacement, with institutional changes, such as the large-scale disappearance of architects from the public sector, and so on. Yet while on one hand, these suggest a diminishing of the operational contexts within which architecture takes place, on the other, we have an expanding appreciation in the academy of the complex ecologies, human and non-human, in which architectural production occurs, to the extent that it becomes difficult to know where our concerns with design might stop, or what might not be relevant, or indeed even what we mean by relevance. One of the ways I think that this is worked out is in the return of the mega project within the academy, just at the point at which the institutional conditions under which projects of this type might be realized seem to have evaporated, in the West at least. As we sit here this evening, vast large-scale projects are underway everywhere in schools of architecture, often focused around infrastructure and frequently also based on international aid-like scenarios, post-catastrophic contexts, etc. Now, there's not time here to go into this in detail, and I don't have any criticism to make of these, for I do see them as absolutely important and necessary things to think about. Here I only want to suggest that they're a symptom of a desire to claim an expanded agency and intensified relevance for architecture at a point when it seems most weak and perhaps least relevant. And of course, in doing this, in striving to conceptualize this expanded agency, what it might be, what it might look like, and this turns into sort of formulations which might look very different from what we take to be conventional models of architectural practice, perhaps to the point where we're not even sure if this is the right way to describe them at all. But inevitably, these projects that are involved in this kind of metacritique are working within this general historical field that is marked out by the interesting. So in conclusion, I wondered, after all this, if it might be necessary to formally and unequivocally issue the following reassurance, which is the first and only edict that will be delivered by the Forbes Chair. And this is, dear colleagues, the word interesting has not been taken away from you, and you're still allowed to use it, and indeed are encouraged to do so. There's a condition, however, that when you do, you must agree to say a little bit more as well. No doubt there are various ways the word interesting can be misused in talking about design projects. But it seems to me that the worst misuse is when things are simply left at that and nothing more is said. Used well, interesting registers a genuine sense of surprise, together with the intimation that there's something of importance at stake here, something that can make a difference that counts. And this in turn opens onto a vivifying and mutual endeavour of thinking and articulation that takes place around a shared matter of concern. And that's not just merely interesting, that's really interesting. Thanks, thank you.